So once again, hello everyone. Thank you for being here tonight to join us for this thoughtful discussion on Veterans Day and in remembrance of all those who served. Tonight we are happy to have you here. My name is Leila. I'm a former intern and current social media consultant for the World Affairs Council of St. Louis. And I am joined by Susan Moore, our IBLP coordinator and board member, and Dr. Tanya Roth, author of Her Cold War. And so, as Pierce mentioned, this event is sponsored by the World Affairs Council of St. Louis, and we hold these events and continue to do these events through our supporters. So, on to Tanya. So Tanya is a local historian and educator here in St. Louis. She received her history PhD from Washington University in St. Louis, and she currently teaches history at MICDS. I myself am an alumna of MICDS, and I've had the pleasure of knowing Tanya as my history teacher, my mock trial coach, and now as a friend. And so, okay, gotta get on to all of her recognitions. Dr. Roth has had her writing and research recognized by several awards, including, got my list here, a fellowship from the American Association of University Women, the Society of Military History's Kaufman Prize, and grants from the John F. Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson, and Gerald Ford Presidential Libraries. Additionally, her writing has also appeared in History News Network, Public Seminar, AHA Today, and most recently in the Washington Post. And so today we will be discussing the topic of military woman power, a theme central to Tanya's book, Her Cold War. And so with all of that said and done, Tanya, do you want to talk a bit more about your book?
Yes, thank you guys so much. This is so wonderful. It's so great to see you here tonight. Thank you for coming. Her Cold War is a book that tells the story of women in the military after World War II and up into the end of the 1970s. It's a period we don't often think about. World War II is really huge in American imagination. It's the good war. It's the war that so many brave people fought in order to help maintain freedom, not just in the US, but the world. And there's so much amazing service and sacrifice that happens in that war. But after the war, the story doesn't end, and the US government decided after World War II that woman power was something that would really help them in the years going forward into the Cold War. But we've often forgotten about it. There are little glimpses we see when we look at just moments in history, the Vietnam War, the Korean War, but overall the stories of women in those decades between 1945 and 1980 are not ones we often think about. So on Veterans Day, it is the women who served in that time who are often overlooked because they're not the ones we think of. I think today women's service is becoming far more visible, and that's changing. But in the period that I studied, it's not there yet. So I tell the story of how women became part of the military permanently after World War II. What did that mean? How did the military structure their service? I think of it from the top down. What are they saying are going to be the regulations? Who's going to do what? What can women do? Which women do they want? But then also, what are women's experiences? That was such a huge part of that story, is understanding how did women feel about their service? What did they get to do? What were the limitations on women's service based on the rules that were created? And then there's this transformation that happens all the way through, slowly, in little bits, and we get to the 1970s, and everything kind of collides in this really great way where we see changes that come in big ways and lay further groundwork for the service that we have today. So when we combat women in serving all over the world, women making firsts every day today. So my work tells the background to that. I don't think you can really understand women's service today without looking back at this period in the Cold War and seeing how it all gets started.
Okay, so looking back to 1948, when the Women's Armed Services Integration Act was passed, why was it at that moment that the notion of military woman power was being formally recognized?
Such a good question. In 1948, nobody thinks of 1948, right? It's not 1945, it's not 1944. The 1948 is a huge moment because that is after 2 years of efforts. And they start trying right after the war ends. We need to keep women. Eisenhower says, women are important. I've seen them in action. Let's use them. A lot of people are saying, well, not really. but the draft is ending. They want to send young men home. They want them to be able to come back to their lives in the United States. And say, there are roles women can do just as well or better than men. We're going to have occupations in Germany. We're going to have occupations in Japan. We have a larger military than ever. So what does that mean? Woman power. So that's part of it. It's all about military necessity. Let's try to reduce the reliance on the draft and use women where we can use them. They're not going to fight. We don't want mothers in uniform. We're going to limit what they do, but there's a recognition that as the military gets larger, there are more spaces for more and more things. Women were already serving as nurses in the nursing corps. They're doing a lot of medical support roles. But they're also now starting to imagine other things that women can do as well.
So after the passing of this act, what did it mean? What did equality mean in the military at that point, and what were the limitations of that equality in that one?
Okay. This is where it gets fun. I love this. I've been thinking about this so much the last couple of years, and this is where I think this book, if I had written it right after I finished graduate school, would be so different. What I've kept thinking about these last few years especially is, what does it mean to be equal? How do we define equality? Is it one fixed notion, or is it something that changes over time? And what I saw when I looked at women's service in the Cold War is that our idea of what it means to be equal is something that's always evolving. So what was equal 50 years ago is not going to look equal today. What's equal today is not going to be what's equal a decade from now. I'm really intrigued by this. I never thought about equality as something that is movable and changeable, because when you achieve one set of goals, what happens next? We get to a fixed point where everything is equal. So in 1948, this is their vision of equality. It's based on what I call gender difference. At the time, it's this idea men and women are inherently different. We need to have different roles in society and in the economy based on their gender. So women are naturally better at caring roles or secretarial work or things of that nature, and men can go do the fighting. We don't have to worry about the fact that women won't be in combat, they would say, because that's not really what women are good at. They're making assumptions based on gender difference. But we can still give women equal roles. We're going to use women in the best ways we can, recognizing their unique talents, and equal pay. We're giving equal pay, equal benefits. That's something that's really revolutionary at the time. There's no women's movement fighting for equal pay at the time. It'll take another 25 years before that becomes one of the big planks of the women's feminist movement in the 70s. That's when equal pay really becomes something Americans think of at a huge level. But in 1948, nobody's thinking equal pay. And Congress goes, oh, you want to make women have equal pay by giving them the same rank? Sure. Now, they don't get every rank. In 1948, the idea of having a female general or admiral isn't something that they would laugh at that. The men in Congress would say, no, absolutely not. We'll never need a woman who's a general. We have 4-star generals, and we have high-ranking women today. So there's a huge shift in thinking that's happened in these decades. But they figure if we give women equal pay based on equal rank, we come into the military, male or female, they'll have the same rank, same pay. That for them is equality, and they think that that's enough. We can look at the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s and the limitations they place on women. They don't see those as hypocritical or contradictory. Like, this is what women do. This is the opportunities they should have. They would say, of course, mothers should not be in uniform because mothers or women who are mothers should be in the home caring for their children. That was the assumption. There's so many assumptions they make about what women should do in those decades. But women in the military challenge that, and that causes the idea of what it means to be equal to change. Because almost right away, in 1950, 1951, a woman steps up and says, you've trained me. I can speak 4 languages. I've served in Japan. I'm an expert in Asian policy. I had a baby. Why does that mean I can't serve? And Congress pretty much laughs at, well, the Peoria Journal Star laughs at her and says, yeah, she should stop tilting in windmills. People laugh at that. Well, we know today that mothers in uniform serve very well. Like, that's not a barrier to what women actually can do. But in the 40s, 50s, 60s, they can't even imagine that. So they say no. By the 60s, women are starting to get access to staying in the military and being mothers on very select basis. In the 70s, the rules changed entirely. It doesn't matter if you have a child while you're in the military, you can stay in. So now, you want to be a mom in the military? Absolutely. There's better support. There's better policies in place today. They couldn't even have imagined this in 1950. It would have been unthinkable. So that idea of equality has changed. We can now look back and say, well, I can't mothers serve? That's unequal. They're like, well, just think it's for the time. So I think this is one of the really interesting stories. I think it prompts us to think about how do we define equality? What are the limitations of equality? And how has equality changed? And I'm still thinking about that. So, but I think it's a really interesting question.
So just following up on
Yeah.
that, how did the women respond to this idea of equality or the male idea of equality in an all-male institution?
It's a great question. And it's, and I've spoken to about 20, 25 different women, and I've read more oral histories and seen more accounts, and I'm recognizing everyone's experience is unique. I think for a lot of women, they have a good experience. If they really like their experience, they stay. If they don't like their experience, they leave. But there are enough women through the years who push back and start asking questions, and not necessarily huge ways, but just asking, well, wait, why can't I do this? What if I can do this? Or, what are the limits on this? So women are pushing for change in small ways, trying to get what they need. Most of the women that I've talked to or read their accounts of would say that in this time period, they wouldn't identify necessarily as feminists or activists, but there was something that needed to change, and they push for that change. And that's something I also think is interesting, that we think of the moments like the women's rights movement in the 70s and so on, but there are also all these times when you don't necessarily have a movement and people push for change because that's what they need to make their situation better.
We're just going to take this moment right now just to see if anybody has any questions.
Yeah.
You know, from the audience.
I was in the 60s, we were stationed on Guam in the 70s, and apparently there had been some type of movement action. And when I was in service, and we moved off base, when I got married, he got housing allowance. I did not. They came back in the 70s and reimbursed me for it.
Yes, that is a huge, important change. So she was just mentioning about how when she was serving in the 60s and the 70s that you said your husband was in the service and he got benefits for you for housing.
Yeah.
But you did not get benefits for him.
No, I get.
Yes. That was one of the early policies, and their assumption is in 1948 that men are the breadwinner. So if a servicewoman is married, that's great. You can be married and be in the military, but we don't want your husband to then get benefits for housing because shouldn't he be making money? is their approach. So they said in the policies that if a husband was dependent for at least 50% of his support. So I'm imagining maybe a wounded veteran who can no longer work, or there's some situation in which the husband is not the breadwinner, they could apply for that. But you're right, most people couldn't get those benefits. In 1973, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's first appearance at the Supreme Court, Frontero versus Richardson. Sharon Frontero was, I believe, in the Air Force, and that was exactly the situation that she was in, that her husband could not get benefits for him. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, that's unconstitutional. And then they gave everybody back benefits. It's amazing. There's even General Mildred Bailey in the Women's Army Corps. Her husband passed away, I think, in 1967, and she was still in service when that change happened. They gave her back pay for all the years that she and her husband had been together and she'd been serving. It's a remarkable moment. Again, that idea of what does it mean to be equal? The Supreme Court says, no, you can't discriminate against male spouses. Yeah.
So following up on, you know, that kind of benefit or lack of benefit for men versus women in the service. What about, could you talk about the maternity policies or the women, the differences in women's physiology?
Yes, that's a huge thing in the military. And the way I started thinking about it is we think about it this way. During wartime and in the military, men's sexual behavior absolutely was something the military worried about. They provided training on sexually transmitted diseases. They handed out condoms. They did things to try to prevent men from getting sick in wartime. but they're imagining that women are not going to be doing that. They're not going to give women condoms and protection, right? But if they get married, they could get pregnant. So they're just very clear by the early 50s. No mothers in uniform, and that just it just strike that down right there. Now there's some gray areas. I've heard of women who they had a commanding officer who let them stay in the service till they started showing and got too far along. There are also women who left the moment they found out. So there's ranges of experience. It wasn't a uniform, you're out, because we hit like 3 months. But that was the big thing. So if you became pregnant, you had a miscarriage, that could also get you out of the service as well. If you were unmarried in particular, but also if you were married, because in having a miscarriage implied you might get pregnant again. And if you married a man and became a stepmother and had children in your house for 30 days or more a year, you were also out. Now, it didn't matter if a man became widowed while he was serving and he all of a sudden had full-time custody of his children. There was an assumption that he must have family or somebody will help take care of the children. But if you're a woman or if you adopt, same thing. So there are certainly accounts of women who give up their baby to their parents for adoption in order to serve. Conversely, there's a woman who serves in Japan in the early 1950s and ends up adopting 5 or 6 Japanese children from orphanages. My understanding is that in Japan after World War II, a lot of servicewomen helped out with visiting orphanages, doing charity work, in other words, while they were in Japan. And one woman adopted, I think, 6 young children and brought them home. And the Army at some point said, yeah, you can't do that anymore, especially after service. I think that's one of those cases where they don't make her leave right away, but it becomes pretty clear there's a pattern. They can't support that. So in the 60s, they started a waiver system. Okay, you can apply. We'll take each situation case by case. And maybe we'll let some people stay in, maybe not others. It's not really until the 70s that they changed the policy entirely. So one of the stories I talk about is Jordy Von Montauk, who had served, I believe, close to 20 years in the Navy, and she and her husband was also Navy. She gets pregnant and she says to the Navy, I have served you this long. I'm so close to retirement. Can I please stay in until retirement? They look at it, they go, yes, but you have to retire on the first date that you're eligible for retirement, which I think is about 5 years down the line. So I know I'm getting my numbers mixed up. It will be a few years. And this is a time they don't have maternity leave policies spelled out. They don't have childcare set up. There are holes in this. How do you, once you're staying, how do you then provide the logistics you need to take care of your child too? And then when she hits her retirement date, by that time, they've changed the rules entirely. Mothers can stay in service. They don't have to wait. She remains in the Navy until her daughter is up in high school. Her daughter then went on to become, she had a pretty high public service role. I don't remember the title, but someone also dedicated to a life of service, just like her mother, which I think is remarkable. You open the door and then see the benefits, not just for one family, but also for the next generation. I spoke to one woman locally who told me about, I believe she left in the early 80s, and she was able to stay with her child, but she told me there was no setup to figure out childcare much earlier than say the 6 weeks that we would imagine that at 6 or 8 weeks you can get the child into daycare. Before that time, had to find a way to have somebody care for a child. That's still an area the military is really grappling with today. How do we provide good support for mothers, especially mothers, women who are pregnant right now or right after their pregnancy, like the first 2 years when they're raising a young child? Still a big area that the military is figuring out. Maternity uniforms, still not really good. Maternity uniforms are not a priority at all.
Jonathan, do we have any questions on Zoom? Okay, I have one. So, as you mentioned, part of your research before the book was interviewing a number of servicewomen. I was just wondering, out of those interviews, did you have a particular one that stuck out for you or that you found most memorable?
That's such a good question. There's so many of them, and I love them all. I had to say, I mean, we're members of the American Legion Post 404 here tonight, and they were really wonderful, and all of you letting me talk to different members to learn their stories. They're all great. I was thinking tonight of Esther Elsperman. I don't know if she's still living. She was a World War II veteran and then served in the Korean War, I believe in her 90s already when I met with her, living in the same house she'd been born in decades earlier in St. Louis. And she just lit up, and she showed me so many pictures from her service and took me through everything. And it was just me and this woman sitting in her house and talking through so much history. It was incredible. I also got to interview the parents of a good friend of mine from graduate school. And so it's one of those things, when you interview the friend of your parents' friends, then they always forget you talk. She's like, oh, my parents. Oh, you know my parents. I'm sorry, I forgot about that. Her parents both served in the Navy together and married after leaving the Navy. So there's too many. They were all so
Do you have
good.
a favorite?
No.
Okay.
They're all
I will say something about that. I don't know what rank was. That's from the tutor, the client of ours. And every year she wanted me to come see her. For her house, it was like gingerbread house.
Oh my gosh, it absolutely was little gingerbread cottage.
Everything perfect. She was the neatest.
She really was.
She has that.
Okay, I thought she was.
Oh, no, you're right, church man. You have to see me once a year. So,
I love that. I think there was one time she asked me about a fence in
which
the
was a
back of her
delight
yard.
to see.
Always fun, yeah, always great. But she asked me about a fence in the back of her yard, and I had no idea. But she was just so much fun to talk to and hear her stories, and certainly a voice that we don't get to hear so much anymore.
So, what, oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, in the space of your book, I guess particularly toward the end, like in the 80s or whatever, how far up rank were women allowed to get?
That's a great question. I'm glad you asked that. The question was about how far in rank women could get by, say, the early 80s. That change starts happening in 1967. Before then, under the 1948 law and until 1967, women could go as far as technically colonel and captain, but there was a stipulation that that was only reserved for the woman in the director role for each of the services. So the assistant chief of personnel for women in the Navy, the director of women in the Air Force, the director of women in the Army Corps, and the director of women in the Marines. When they left those roles, they had to step back a rank. And this works okay. So we started in the 60s, and women have been in the military for longer and longer, and they're reaching they're at that level where they need to be promoted or leave. So there's more and more pressure. But part of the story that I think is really interesting is that President Lyndon Johnson decides he wants to make one of his secretaries a colonel because she's military and he thinks she's amazing. And so it looks like this workaround that, oh, okay, Johnson will get more female colonels, we'll get this change, and the lawyers say, you really can't do that. But between the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Services, which advised the Department of Defense on women's service, and Kennedy's President's Commission on the Status of Women a few years earlier, you have a movement of women who are saying we have to change rank limitations. And it's not just the commanders or the women in charge who are saying we have to change this. It's a lot of women saying this is inequitable. We can't do this. So Lyndon Johnson essentially works hard to help promote a law being passed in Congress. He doesn't do all the work. The women's service leaders are fighting for this, and other women as well. 1967, they say, okay, no more rank limits, and they get rid of a 2% cap on women in the military. Before that, only 2% of the military could be female, and they get rid of that in 67. So in 1970, we get the first female generals. The head of the Army Nurse Corps becomes a general, and the head of the Women's Army Corps becomes a general. By the middle of the 70s, pretty much all the leaders of women's services are generals, and Jean Holm of the Air Force becomes the first 2-star general. So there's no caps on that by the time we hit the 80s. But I was just looking through my social media history today, and apparently today marks 13 years since we got the first 4-star female general in the military. So it takes a while to get up to that level. It takes another 30 some years.
I'm sure it does for men too.
Absolutely, absolutely. It does take a lot of time.
I just had a question that popped up sort of in conjunction to this previous one. Could you talk more about how the transition into allowing women to have combat roles come about?
Yes, that is much more recent, and for some of my memory gets a little sticky since it's so recent, but some of it starts a little earlier. Into the 70s, it's still no combat. They don't even actually define combat until the 70s. Finally, somebody says, if you're going to tell us that women can't be in combat, we need to know what combat is. I think because in part of the Vietnam War showed people that combat wasn't what they always thought it was. Combat was changing, and now we have airplanes, we have ships, and we have jungle warfare. What do we mean by combat? Like, do we mean that women really can't just go push a button and fly a drone? I mean, drones are more current, right? But that equivalent, like, are we saying that it's not appropriate for a servicewoman to literally sit in a bunker and push a button to deploy a bomb? Is that combat? And at the time they say, yeah, that's combat or combat support. So no, it's really, we start seeing women on ships in the late 1970s. Mostly first hospital ships, but then they open it to other women as well. The Gulf War, I think, is a big important point where things turn. Military aviation in particular, but then full removal of combat limitations comes about 6 years ago, 2015, 2016, when that range of things. That's the moment where the Secretary of Defense says no more gender-based combat limitations. Before then, of course, women are serving in Afghanistan, they're serving in Iraq. They are the female engagement teams in Afghanistan, for example. We have women who are going out to the field and talking to local civilians and doing work that brings them into situations that 30, 40 years earlier would have been deemed combat. They're not in roles that are supposed to be combat. The downside of that means, though, that they're doing the work that looks like combat, they're in the same risk. But because it's not classified as combat, they don't get the same hazard pay and benefits that would go with that. So removing the combat barriers means that you can actually give women the pay and benefits they deserve for those roles.
And that kind of goes back to the equality, is that
Exactly.
things are equal, but yet they weren't equal because they didn't have the same opportunity.
Exactly. Yes, that lack of opportunities is so huge.
I'm going to ask you a different question. I'm going to change gears a little bit, and because as I read the acknowledgement to your book, it said that this book started with one question. So what was that question, and how did it take you from a question to a book that's
Yes. I have to remind myself the question. I'm
many
so
pages
sorry.
long and very well footnoted and
Those are
researched?
fun. Yes, okay, so I want to make sure I didn't, just after writing so much, sometimes I'm really paranoid I'm gonna forget something, and get something wrong. This all started when I was an undergraduate, and I was a very dorky undergraduate. I wanted to write a thesis. I thought that would be fun. You can blame my parents. They went to graduate school when I was 5. I thought everybody wrote a thesis, so I just thought it'd be fun. And Mizzou is where I went for undergrad, and they said, well, if you want to write a thesis, you have to take an undergraduate seminar. I looked at the list, and the only thing that sounded remotely interesting was gender and World War I. I didn't know anything about either of those, but I thought World War I, that sounds pretty cool. I mean, war always sounds interesting. And the first day of class, I was out of my league. This professor goes, what do you think you want to write about? I had no idea. There's a stack of books sitting next to me, and on top was a book called Testament of Youth. And it was the account of Vera Britton, who was a woman from pretty upper class family in England before World War I. Her brother went off to the war, all of his friends went off to the war. She decided to volunteer with the Voluntary Aid Detachment, essentially kind of like being a nurse, but doing it after 6 weeks of training, and it changed her life. She became a pacifist, but that book changed my life because I wrote a thesis about it over the next year, and I thought that was it. But I finished undergrad, and I thought I would go to some other stuff, and I kept thinking about this. I kept wondering, well, what happens next? We know that there's another war that comes, and I knew a little bit about women in World War II because that story comes up more commonly. Well, what happens next? We have women in the military today, and I couldn't let go of the question. So that question of what happens next, such a small question, but also so big, that led me to graduate school. And the first semester, I took a Cold War history class, and a new book had come out about servicewomen in the Korean War era. And I think it was a throwaway line about the Women's Armed Service Act of 1948. Well, what's this? Wait, equal pay? nobody was picking up on that. Nobody had noticed it. It was just, oh, this law, women are in there. And then they focus on women's stories, which is such an important part. And I went, this is really interesting. So I just kept pushing on. And my family, no military background. My grandfather was in World War II. My mother is someone who would never call herself an activist or feminist. She's I love her dearly. I don't think she's listening, but you're amazing, Mom. I remember my mother's of that age where she was in college in the late 60s and the early 70s. I know there's lots of student activism. And I remember thinking, well, did my mom do any of that? And my mom's like, I think I went to one protest once, and I'm not sure what we were protesting. So I've always wondering then, because not everybody protests, not everybody gets involved. So what does it look like when we look at a history where it's not a movement necessarily? It's not people rising up and protesting and going out and doing mass action. So that was, I think, one of the things that kept me going. I was really curious about that because I think that the second wave feminist movement immensely important in American history, and protests and activism immensely important. And I think there's also a really interesting story about the small things that happen in people's day-to-day lives that maybe we look back in retrospect and go, wow, I changed something, or I was part of something and I didn't realize it at the time.
Yes, I have a Zoom question here. So Anya Tawari has a question regarding opposition met when women get more involved in the military. Was there opposition, and if so, how was it overcome?
Yes, hi Anya. Anya's one of my students. I love her. So she's great. Thank you for being on tonight. There is opposition, and it comes in all sorts of ways. Women talked to me about how they had to work harder and just to prove that they could be there. Especially imagine if you are training electronics, you have to prove that you are the best because the men in the same room don't understand why there's a spot going to a woman. Men and women's initial training happened separately, so I think that reinforced it. And we're only now starting to integrate training by gender. How much that reinforced it, I can only make guesses, but imagine you enter the military and there's so much work to become part of the group, to become part of this culture. And you do this in an arena that is all female or all male for whatever extended period of time that might be for your initial training. I think that kind of reinforces it a little bit that all of a sudden you go out to workspaces and mostly men, but one woman. I did not hear stories of blatant issues such as sexual assault or harassment, or if I did, when you do oral history, there's definitely several factors that go involved. Like, first of all, I was not a very experienced oral historian, so I was very nervous to ask questions sometimes, but also there are sensitive topics that I think there are stories out there that I don't know about opposition. In particular, one of the things I find interesting with women's service is that United States military up through World War II was segregated by race. The Women's Armed Services Integration Act of 1948 passes June 12th, and on July 26th, President Truman desegregates the military. The women's services integrate racially before anything else. The Women's Air Force almost immediately is racially integrated. The Women Marines have one of their first boot camps has 2 African American women, Annie Graham and Annie Lamb. And the leaders are like, all right, we are putting them all in the same barracks. It doesn't matter what color their skin is. And yet they do divide them geographically because they're assuming that the women are coming from northern cities and the women from the south may not be as nice to them, is the assumption. They also don't know how to handle things like how do we care for Black women's hair. They end up asking one of the custodial staff to help them find materials that they need and having women do their hair in the office off to the side. So there's some of that in, as well. So we've got race, we've got gender. That's a story that I think I was able to get a little glimpse of to see the opposition, but not perhaps as much as is actually out there. If that makes sense. I'm qualifications.
Can you talk a little bit about women entering the academies or being admitted to the academy?
Yes. This is such a big moment in 1976. It's in the middle of the Equal Rights Amendment going through ratification in the states. Members of Congress and heads of the military by the early 70s have started thinking about what if the Equal Rights Amendment passes? How will this change women's service? And they're kind of proactive. They're not amazing, but they're proactive about this because they recognize there could be major changes. And there's questions about the service academies. Service academies, they were in their conversations, they say, well, service academies train people for combat leadership. And if women aren't in combat, why would we want them in combat leadership training? There are a lot of people who resist this. And finally, in 1976, it becomes, the ERA has not been ratified by every state, has not fully gone through. But in 76, they're like, we need to admit women. This is, again, going back to equality has changed. There's no more limits on women's ranks. They have generals. They can start to imagine that, you know, women might actually be able to serve there. I think one of my favorite stories with that is a senator from Minnesota, I believe, said, last year I had 3 applicants for the Air Force Academy that I could have picked. One of them had a pilot's license, but that applicant was a woman, so I couldn't admit her. And I can't imagine today, like, would you turn down the only applicant with a pilot's license for the Air Force Academy? Right, that's a pretty big, oh, wow. So they changed it. In 1976, the first group of women entered West Point, the Naval Academy, the Air Force Academy, and that was hard. I have not looked at as many oral histories, and I have not been able to talk to any graduates myself, but those 4 years were very tough. I believe the next class as well. They did survey the cadets the year before the women came to ask them how they thought about it, which may not have been a great idea because you're going to survey a bunch of young men about, well, how do you feel about this? They might not like what's going to change. So they had some interesting approaches to how do we allow women in here. But it's such an important thing because, yes, as you're pointing out, it takes time for everybody to get promoted to say general, correct? But combat leadership, even if that's what the academies in part train you for, if you don't have access to that, then how do we give leaders at higher levels throughout the military who may not ever become generals, but having women at higher levels changes things, I think. I think that having not just a bunch of men at those levels, it gives potential to change the conversation when you have more people in the room.
Yes, I have another question. This one is from Carolyn Hood. She says, Lyndon Johnson has often been referred to as the macho egalitarian. Do you agree? Were his actions significantly important to the movement of women attaining new heights in the military?
I love that question. Johnson is so interesting. If you've never been to the Johnson Presidential Library in Austin, Texas, you should go because it definitely there was all in there. I'm kind of fond of him too. He's such an interesting man because I think he gets so lost in the Vietnam War. I think these are these surprising moments. There is a really good biography of Lady Bird actually that just came out, and it had some really interesting insights as well into some of these women that he worked with. It seems very fitting for him that he would actually be pro changing some of these regulations. He was the father of daughters. I think for him, he really saw it as, oh, this is just what fits. This is what we should do. I don't think he was radical about it, but I think he saw this as practical, necessary to move it to the next level. And I think he's a man that we maybe underestimate sometimes, and it'd be really interesting to see more on his approach to women's issues.
So in your book, you also talk about different organizations, women's organizations that contributed, that were outside of the military,
Yes.
that contributed to forwarding women who were in the military. Could you talk about that? And also you wrote a recent Washington Post article.
Yes, I did. Dakowitz is one of my really proud moments of this project, and that sounds really silly. This is the researcher in me. The Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Services. It gets founded in 1951. It's a group of civilian women. And the idea is they've done this in World War II. Let's use civilian women to help the Department of Defense understand how do we make military service attractive to Americans, but also how do we find out what military women need? So they have, the numbers vary. I'm going to say about 50 women in general from across the nation for a variety of roles. there's Vanderbilts, there's Pillsbury's, there's names that at the time would have sounded probably pretty impressive. It's really hard to chase them down though, because they're all referred to as Mrs. Pillsbury Lord. And you're like, who are you? I need not your husband's name, I need your name. So I did a lot of detective work to figure out who these women were, because once I could figure out their real names and not their husband's names, I could find out over their careers. We had women who were like a neuroembryologist, women who were high up in education, women who, for example, there was a woman who was the head of a major Black women's sorority. And that took a lot to figure out, because I didn't know anything about her racial background or anything about her education for a long time. So these women, it's a little inconsistent. It's not that every servicewoman would have necessarily known about them or ever talked to them, but they are there and they are going out and talking to women. And they are the voice persistently in the 50s and the 60s saying, okay, let's look at women's needs. They look at housing, they look at training, they look at other opportunities. They do a lot to promote women's service. And when we start seeing interest from the women's movement as it comes up, so first Kennedy's President's Commission on the Status of Women starts looking at it, there's overlap. There's women from Dakowitz who serve there. And then in the late 60s, early 70s, the National Organization for Women comes in, and we get all these groups of women who are saying, what do we do about Womanpower? Dakowitz still exists today. It's not all female anymore. Men can also be members. But last January, and I didn't find this out till the summer, last January, there was a proposal to eliminate Dakowitz as part of a budget saving measure. They were planning to integrate Dakowitz into a new organization that would have focused on both racial and gender discrimination, both important issues, but bending it into one unit is a lot for them to take on, and it would have been much smaller. So my piece this summer talked about the importance of Dakowitz and all its advocacy work. On their website, they had testimony from the last couple of years from servicewomen who came and said, these are the issues we're facing today. We're facing issues related to being pregnant service members, to passing our physical fitness tests after we have our children. Here are the issues that women have today. And Dakowitz is like, all right, let's do something about this. They're the voice that goes to the Department of Defense and says, let's change things. They weren't always successful, but I think that voice, having someone as an advocate, is an important one. President Biden and Secretary of Defense did some work this fall, and that's been reversed. Dakowitz is not going away. So I'm curious to see what the next step is, but that's what I'm curious. Just because all the work I had to do to find stuff, a lot of like finding programs, and their speeches are very interesting because they had to go talk to non-specialists, and they'd be like, let us tell you about Dakowitz. They do fashion shows, which seems a little silly now, but that was one way they thought they'd appeal to women. Like, let's have a uniform fashion show and show you all the beautiful uniforms you can wear and talk to you, and have women who are in the military to promote it as well. So they did some really interesting things. I really love them.
I have another question. This one's from Cal Barton. How much did you look into gender diversity in Britain's military post-World War II? Were things progressing similarly in a nation that prides itself on its military to a lesser degree than the US?
That's a great question, Cal. I don't know anything about the military after World War II, I'm afraid. That I think is another layer that is really interesting to think about how militaries around the world change. So I don't know the trajectory in England's. I know them during World War II, but I don't know them after. I'm sorry. But you can email me if you want to.
I just want to take this opportunity just to see if anybody in our audience would like to talk about, share any of their experiences. I know we have a number of vets in the audience. Don't be shy. Very shy. No,
Okay. Well, I have another question. So what conversations are you hoping that your book will inspire within the military about what equality is going to mean moving forward? Like, what issues do you still see that you think need reworking?
This one I think is that would be amazing if this helped ignite conversations that would lead to improvements for servicewomen and servicemen. I keep thinking about a quote that goes to that. Shirley Chisholm in 1970 gave a speech on the Equal Rights Amendment, and I've been thinking about it because a colleague took part of it on the stairs where I walk by every day. At the end of her speech, she talks about the importance of gender equality. And she actually quotes a man who was writing in the late 60s about gender equality. So I brought that here because I think this gets to this question of why is it so important to have equality and to keep thinking about what this means. So she quotes Leo Kanowitz. As long as organized legal systems, at once the most respected and most feared of social institutions, continue to differentiate sharply in treatment or in words between men and women on the basis of irrelevant and artificially created distinctions, the likelihood of men and women coming together to regard one another as fellow human beings primarily and only secondarily as representatives of another sex will continue to be remote. So if we're still focusing on differences, we're not going to have men and women focusing on each other as humans first, and how do we get rid of the sex barriers? When men and women are prevented from recognizing one another's essential humanity by sexual prejudices, nourished by legal as well as social institutions, society as a whole remains less than it could otherwise become. And women's roles have changed so much in the military in the last decade, in the years since my book ends. But there's still a long way to go because now we can have conversations they couldn't even have in the 40s. We can't have conversations about what servicewomen or mothers need if you don't let servicewomen be mothers in the military. If you don't admit that there are power dynamics that lead to sexual assault and harassment and discrimination, you can't address those. And in the aftermath of the William murder in 2020, the Fort Hood investigation has brought to light many of the problems with tracking sexual assaults in the military. These are conversations that still need to be had. And I don't say that to imply that the military is a horrible place where women are sexually assaulted. It's bad. I think there's a lot of potential for the military to be a really leader in American society. But we tend to think of the military still as they go out and fight, and we don't think as much about the people who are in it. But I think what her Cold War shows, I hope, is that when you pay attention to these things, like having equal pay and paying attention to policies that benefit everyone, that there's potential to really create an environment where everybody is valued and that everybody can serve, and that's just better for our country. I mean, they talk a lot about unit cohesion. That was one of the excuses for not allowing women into combat was, oh, if we put women in combat, that's going to ruin unit cohesion. That hasn't happened. We have better unit cohesion. We just have to rethink our assumptions. And that's what starts happening in the 70s. There's a rethinking of assumptions. There's a lot of, we assume women can do this. We assume women should do this based on these old cultural ideas. And I think we're still now thinking through, if we get rid of those assumptions and start really going with what can people do and respect that, where can we go?
But do you think that is the military being basically a male institution, because that's the way it was created? Do you think those are the things that would enable the military to change, to be more open, or to change those kinds of assumptions, since they are starting from the assumption that it's male?
It's a big hurdle. That since the military is so male dominated, masculine, everything starts from that question of it being male. I think that's what makes it harder to make the change. I'm really curious, like what could be possible if we could get rid of that. There are some scholars who are like, you can never do it. Cynthia Enlow, a sociologist, has said, nope, it's too military, it's too male, you can never undo it. But I'd like to think maybe something.
Jonah Zaks has a question. He asked, if you were to write a 3-page paper on this book, what would you say the most important thesis is?
Is he one of your students? They're all people I know, and I love them. So yes, Jonah is a graduate of my accelerated U.S. history class, where you have to, they read an article and they write a 3-page paper outlining the argument. Oh yes, you remember those, but I didn't have you for that class, so we're good. Okay, first up.
What grade did you get? No, just kidding.
I don't remember, but he's at WashU, is doing great. So, all right, so I have to narrow down to one chapter. So I'm going to narrow it down to one chapter because they only do this on a limited basis. I would take contents because I love them all so much. All right, I love all these chapters, but my editor did ask me early on why we had chapter 1, because it's a lot about a law being made, and maybe it's not the most interesting thing in there. I think it's interesting, so I hope you do too. But if I was going to write a 3-page paper on chapter 1, I would say the argument is that after World War II, the U.S. military decided out of necessity to create a space for women on basis of equality, but a very specific vision of equality. And then you and I can talk about when we go to the body paragraphs.
I have another question. This one from Lisa Gibson. She says she hasn't read the book yet, but do you explore eating disorders among female military members, especially during academy years?
That's a great question. I don't, but I love that question. That'd be a really interesting topic to look at. And I'm not sure if anybody's doing work on that, but I think that does speak to the challenges the servicewomen face to get specific ideals. There's a lot of material in the archives from the 1960s, for example. I remember going to the Air Force archives, and they had these brochures that were made for women by like the Toilet Goods Association of America. Ironically, it was all about how do you present yourself as your best, how do you do your hair, how do you do your makeup, and also eating. And they have in there this whole prescribed, like, here are some things you can eat, and here's how much you can eat. So there's definitely they focus on nutrition, and so this is pre-academy years, but I think there is a precedent for it for women thinking about like how much are you supposed to eat versus not eat. There's also some training videos in the 1970s that are on YouTube, and there's an entire segment. It's about which woman is right for this promotion, and they have 3 women in particular they follow, and one of them eats too many candy bars. And will get punchy. And there's a whole line in there about how if you eat this much per day, how many pounds you're gonna gain in a year. So, so I think that would be a really interesting topic to look at, because I think it speaks to the larger issue of how militaries define the military body. And today, that the main issue with that is women who just come back from pregnancy or breastfeeding, and they just recently in the last year changed some of the standards that what test score did you have to get and when did you take those tests? Because women were being cut because they couldn't pass tests.
So it's obvious that you've done a lot of research in order to write this book. So one question I have is, how long, over what time period in your lifetime did this span?
Most of it was done in graduate school. I started working on this in my first year. Chapter 1 is the oldest one. I've been working on that since I was a first-year graduate student. But my trips to the archives were over about 3 years, give or take. And in that time, the best strategy in the archives, you only have a limited time. So I had to pay to go to Washington, D.C. to go to the archives. And the National Archives in College Park has so much material. What you do is you get them to bring you as much as you can, and then you photograph the heck out of it. You just take pictures of every document, and then I would go back to my hotel at night and I would process all the photographs as PDF files. So I literally have thousands of documents, and then I came back and cataloged them. And I'm still, like, this many years later, I'll still be thinking of something, and I'm like, oh, where's that one document on this thing? And I can still find it because I have no idea. Especially brochures, I can go back and find those. But it was definitely about, my longest trip was 2 weeks in DC, in the DC area, a week into Johnson, a few days in the Eisenhower Library, which was really good. I didn't spend much time at the Ford Library, but the Ford Library has an amazing collection on the Civil Rights Amendment. For the book, I didn't go to any new archives, in part because I had so much. The chapters of my dissertation were about 50 pages each, and nobody wants to read that. So there's a whole lot that had to be restructured and cut. So a lot of getting the dissertation, the book, was reimagining what is the story and finding the heart of it. And that means I have lots of materials that I can work with. And now there's also a number of materials that are online available too, such as the videos. Or I had not looked at movies, and I watched Skirts Ahoy, and I watched Never Wave at a Whack. Movies that came out in the early 50s that I read about and I haven't seen, and they're remarkable to look at. But it's so fascinating. You never know what you're gonna find in the archive. So sometimes it's about pursuing something tangential. So I went through a lot of stuff about, I was really interested in desegregation, and there were a couple commissions in the 60s that looked at how was desegregation working. Not very well. But I was really interested to see what they said. They didn't look at women at all. Nothing. They're only talking about male servicemen, male service members. So I have lots of dead ends that I've looked at and found and just never used. But I'd rather have that than not enough.
So I guess that would lead me to the next question of, so you have another book in mind?
I was thinking of a few things. This honestly, there's a point where this book almost didn't come out a few years ago. I had tried first, agent, tried to see if I can go traditional popular press publishing. It's really hard for nonfiction. And I wasn't thinking academic press, just because to do something like this, you have to have it peer reviewed by scholars in the field. So this manuscript went to two different people who are professors. I don't know, I have guesses, but I don't know who they are. And they read it and they said, okay, does this stand up to the standards for historical work? Do I talk enough about the other historians who've done work in this field? Have I used primary sources effectively? All those things. So I wasn't sure I wanted to go that level. So I put a hold on it. And I remember thinking, should I do another project? Well, I couldn't let this go. So I have thought about nothing else but this book for so long that it's a big shift now to think what's next. I've been dabbling with a few things in mind. Part of me thinks that it might be something St. Louis focused, because access to archives and time is definitely hard when you're not a professor, perhaps. It's hard when you're a professor, but as a high school teacher, I think there's the challenges there. I have had a random thought about St. Louis education system, private schools, in what ways have private schools in St. Louis reinforced racial segregation. I don't know. I'm going to play around, see what there is. I also wouldn't mind writing a novel. So I'm thinking of this spring as the time when I start reading and seeing what am I going to do next.
What does Andrew, your son, think about him being an author now?
My son, so he was not alive when I started this project, and I waited until I had him in 2013, and that was about the point I was ready to go back and reread my dissertation and see if I wanted to do anything. And it didn't happen because I had a baby. So he's kind of grown up in the background, and when I finished writing this, he was doing marathon sessions on Minecraft with his dad, so I can actually work. He's also involved in a few presentations, so he's not here tonight, but he's wonderful. He kind of gets it. He didn't really know what I was doing in the basement. When the book came out, my husband's like, whose name is on the cover? It's like, it's Mom's name. So he insisted on taking a copy to his school to show the librarian. He's like, maybe they could put it in our school library. I'm like, I don't think so, but I love it. So he has proudly shown it to the school librarian, to his teacher, to his special ed teacher. Everybody's seen it, so they all know about it. So he loves it. Neither he nor my husband have actually read the books.
Well, you can say they kind of lived it.
That's what my husband says. I'm about ready to put a copy by his bedside. So,
And I'm sure everybody here will be buying a book, but what books would you recommend, other books would you recommend, maybe about the time or just history that you really love?
if you like historical fiction, there's a really good book, and I can't remember the title, but we'll get it for you. I just read this year about the women of the 6888 Postal Battalion in World War II. What was that?
I read an article on it. It
Oh,
was amazing.
It's so good. This is the only group of Black women in the military who went overseas during World War II. They cleared a huge postal backlog. I think there might be some more stuff coming out about them soon. That book was so good. And there's a couple recent histories of the Army Nurse Corps that have come out in the last 2 years. I don't look at nurses at all, not because I don't like nurses, but because the Women's Armed Services Integration Act did not cover nurses. That was separate legislation. If you're interested in the nurses, Kara Vick's book, Officer and Nurse Women, is all about the Army Nurse Corps and the Vietnam War, for example. So I think there'll be some good stuff coming out in the near future that I know from some people too. So
I have a quick question about that. So the 1948 Act that didn't cover the women's nurse corps.
It didn't. They did that separately. The Army Nurse Corps and the Navy Nurse Corps date to beginning of the 20th century, right around the Spanish-American War. They're like, we need nurses. Women are nurses. We'll do this. So it becomes in the first half of the 20th century a professionalized corps. The women who come there are trained to be nurses. They are nurses, and that continues in World War II. So that there's never really any debate about whether there should be nursing corps. It's just that around, I think it's 1947, the Army Nurse Act and the Navy Nurse Act passed for permanent status. Those histories are fascinating because they're only women, and it takes another couple of decades to get men in there. So it's kind of a reverse situation that these are supposed to be for women only. And that's really intriguing. So, but they passed that sooner with far less debate because they need nurses. And it's a feminine role too, so it takes a little less debate to work through.
I'm gonna go back to the equality, equal but yet not equal.
Yeah.
Because I think you talked about homosexuality
Yes.
and lesbianism and the different standards that were involved versus applying it to men versus women.
Yeah. Yes. I have a whole chapter on sexuality in the military, particularly focusing on lesbianism. I was building on some really great work that was done by another scholar who helped me find these materials. Maybe aware that Don't Ask, Don't Tell kept anyone who was gay or lesbian out of the military formally until 2011. Right as I finished my project in grad school, they ended it, which is amazing. Prior to that, Don't Ask, Don't Tell lasted from the Clinton administration to 2011. And the idea was, okay, you can be a gay, lesbian individual and serve in the military, just don't tell us that. We're not going to ask you if you're gay or lesbian, you don't tell us you're gay. Stand the closet, you're fine. Before that, the policy was if you were found to be gay or lesbian, you were going to be discharged dishonorably. The military did not want men and women who were gay or lesbians. The origin of this, if we go back to the 40s, there's a really great book coming out under fire about homosexuality in World War II. It's incredible. It's probably about 30 years old now, but it's the work, and you're interested about homosexuality in the military. It's fantastic. For a lot of Americans, World War II was a national coming out experience because for the first time, they meet others like themselves. And so we start to see the roots of what will later become the gay rights movement. Not direct correlation, but there's a shift. So in the 1950s, one of the fears they have about women in the military is this is a group of all women. We don't want lesbians. But what happens if women are joining because they're lesbian and they can be around other women? There is a fear among the military leaders that they're creating an environment that would promote lesbianism. They try to create policies to prevent themselves from recruiting women who are lesbians, but they don't actually know what a lesbian is. One of the things that gets talked about in materials, there's a Navy report in the 50s that says, here's the thing, it's easier to identify homosexuality in a man than a woman because of the way that women and men are socialized differently to interact with each other. It is more acceptable for women to have close relationships, friendships with other women, and people don't think anything about it. But for two men to have a similar close relationship, that would look a little different. That would raise suspicions. So because there are these gray areas, they don't actually know. Their assumption in the 50s as well, we think a lesbian is a woman with short hair who's very masculine acting and plays basketball. I mean, they're stereotypes. So there are a few witch hunts in the early 50s during McCarthy years where if you go to the National Archives, there are files this thick of lesbian discharge accounts. Now they're grouping some of them together, but what happens is somebody will say, oh my gosh, there's a lesbian in my unit. And then they will go on a hunt to find everybody. So groups of 20 women, all implicated in the same thing. They interview each one. They put them through lie detector tests. They have them undergo psychiatric evaluation because at this time, homosexuality is still defined as literally it's classified as deviance in the DSM, whatever number that was. The earlier version,
I don't remember.
Yeah.
Earlier, maybe 3 or 4.
it might have been 3, might even have been 2. The standard for psychological care at the time. They ask, the questions are very intense. They're asking questions about their sex life. They're telling them, well, if you admit to other women, being lesbians. Oh, you're not? Well, you will tell us who is a lesbian, you can go free. And they don't always adhere to that. These are these moments that are more rare. They figure out pretty quickly that it's probably not in their best interest to have these witch hunts because it just will look bad. So I think implicitly on a lot of levels, the women's services they kind of go to a don't ask, don't tell. I think that really was the way a lot of the military was informally working. But that's what they're worried about. They're worried about these women who they don't think should be there because they think it's going to sully the reputation of the women's services. And also the men's services as well. But in Vietnam and in Korea, when you need manpower, it looks a little different potentially. One of the most interesting stories I found in the archives was I was going through Women's Army Corps materials and the folder said married wax case, and wax, WACS, the Women's Army Corps. I was like, what's this? And I opened it up. And in 1976, there was an interesting case of a woman, Marie Soda von Hoffberg, who was in the Women's Army Corps. She just got married, and this is after Frontero versus Richardson, so her spouse could get benefits. Her spouse came to the base to get signed up for using post exchange and everything, and somebody recognized the spouse and was like, wait a second. The spouse was a man named Christian von Hoffberg. The Christian von Hoffberg had previously been a woman and had served in the Women's Army Corps, so it was recognized. And they have no idea what to do with this. So of course this goes straight to the ranks. They bring in sexual experts from a university in Texas to ask questions about this. They got married in Alabama by a justice of the peace. And when they asked the justice of the peace, he said, well, I didn't know that one of these people wasn't biologically male. It looked like a man and a woman, and that's all we needed. So they were legally married. And the military is like, we're really uncomfortable with this. They end up giving Marie Soda von Hoffberg an honorable discharge for homosexuality. That's how they end up defining it. They're not yet thinking about language about transgender identity. They don't know what to do with it. But today, President Biden overturned the previous ban on transgender service members. To my knowledge, this is one of the first cases of the military encountering there are other service members who are transgender from that period, but this is they just have no idea what to do. And it's not a story that we know very much about. Oh yes.
I haven't read the book yet, but how does your book flow like chronologically? And if so, do you have like chapters?
Yes. So the structure of the book, I put it in 3 parts because you're asking about the flow of it,
Yes.
right? Okay, so it's 3 parts. Part 1 gets you at how did military leaders structure service? So first the Integration Act, but then how do they recruit women and then how do they train women? I think of it as top down. What does the military think that they want and how are they structuring it? The middle part is about servicewomen's experiences. What does that actually look like? So a chapter on, I'm interested in the military as a career field, which is not often how we think of it. So a chapter on the jobs that women do, they're coming into this for career field opportunities. And that's what the military is selling this as. Like, you can come have a career in the military, unlike men who are being drafted. There's certainly men who are certainly pursuing military careers, but they're definitely looking at women as careers. So chapter on women's careers, and then on women as mothers and the policies about motherhood and how women respond to that, and then homosexuality in the military. The final part brings those together and gets at how do things change, and it's a combination of external advocates, the women's own change as well. So it kind of mostly moves chronologically, culminating in the 70s and early 80s, but there's moments in the early chapters where it'll jump forward to the 70s and go back. But I thought of it in those 3 parts: top down, women's experiences, and then how does all this change come together? Favorite chapter. I'm really proud of how the chapters on motherhood and homosexuality came together. Those were really hard to write. Some of it is the sources are hard to find. Some of it is just analyzing it and thinking through what this means. But those I really like. I think that they're pieces that tell important parts of history that I think are still very relevant today. So I wrote those too. Thanks.
Anybody else have any other questions? We're kind of reaching our time.
I was wondering, do you have any, are you familiar with WIMSA?
Yes. Oh, yes. The Women's Memorial. They were wonderful. I went to research with them a couple of times. I just emailed them last week and they said, oh, will you send us your books? So I threw a copy of the mail to them. They're so wonderful. If you don't know the Women in Military Service for America Memorial in DC, it's fantastic.
And it's a
they're so
museum
good.
too, so they
Yes.
have a lot, and it's, you know, you can visit it, and it's right on the entrance to Arlington Cemetery.
I think they just closed the doors for renovation.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they're doing a big renovation, I think, over the next year. I'm not sure if it opens in the spring again or next fall, but they just, I saw something in their emails, went, oh, wow, I'm not going there for another year.
That's why he does it.
Any other questions? No, not on Zoom. Well, I guess I would like to thank Dr. Roth for a fascinating discussion about women in the military and women power. I want to thank everybody here as well